Ühe Põhjala väikeriigi juubeli puhul on ühte tema teatrisse kogunenud kirev kunstnike seltskond mitmetest maailma nurkadest. Koos musitseerides ning kunsti luues loodetakse leida vastus pakilisele küsimusele, kas on elu pärast kapitalismi. Igal nädalal innustavad neid erinevad globaalse haardega mõtlejad, lähevad ringlusesse üha uued värsked ideed, saavad vastatud üha uued küsimused. Kunstnikud mõistavad, tunnetavad ja reageerivad. Nad kutsuvad seda vonKrahl.Akadeemiaks.
This year in the Democratic primary, there were two candidates, a woman and a black. The African-American won the election. 40 years ago, any of that would have been totally inconceivable. So there's been a big change since the 1960s, and that's very significant. Whatever one thinks about the candidates, that's a tribute to the activism, mostly of young people, in the 1960s, and its aftermath, the feminist movement, which radically changed the consciousness of the country, was in the 70s, other developments in later years. But these activist movements have in fact contributed to civilizing the country quite significantly. It's striking that if you look at exit polls, the largest support for Obama was among younger people who've been through this experience of activism and its effects. So that's a matter of considerable significance. We should be willing to put it into context. This is 150 years after the formal declaration of equality. And notice that while it's a political victory, it's not really overcoming racism. To see how much that's true, simply take a look at, for example, incarceration rates. The U.S. has far and away the highest per capita incarceration in any part of the world where statistics mean anything. That's since about 1980. It's been increasing rapidly since 1980. It has nothing to do with crime. Crime's been declining, and it's overwhelmingly black and, to an extent, Latino. That's a reflection of much larger general problems in the society. Nevertheless, it is a historic change that a ugly tradition of racism that goes back to the founding of the country has been significantly mitigated to the extent that a black candidate can be elected president. Looking over a longer stretch, the hegemony of the United States in the world system has been declining since the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, the United States literally had half the world's wealth. The war was very beneficial to the U.S. economy. It ended the Depression, industrial production almost quadrupled in a semi-command economy. And it not only had half the wealth of the world, but incomparable security. It controlled the entire Western Hemisphere, both oceans, the opposite sides of both oceans, controlled Middle East energy resources, and it was bound to decline. And as decolonization set in and the other industrial countries recovered from the disaster of the war, it did decline. By about 1970, the U.S. share of world wealth was maybe 25%, and it stayed pretty much like that since. By the early 1970s, it was already clear that the world economy was becoming what's called tripolar. There was a North American economic area, European economic area, centered on Germany mostly, and France, and an Asian, Northeast Asian economic area at that time, centered mostly on Japan, now including China, with India on the periphery. And these, Latin America, however, was almost completely suppressed. It went through a terribly violent period. U.S.-imposed national security states, neo-Nazi-style murders, dictatorships, atrocities, crimes, and so on, and very little development. That's changing again. Latin America, for the first time in hundreds of years, in fact, in its history, is beginning to take some steps towards integration and independence. Well, Europe has been slowly moving towards integration, of course, since World War II. World War II was a watershed. For centuries, Europe had been the most savage place in the world. The Europeans their highest goal was to slaughter each other. The 30 Years' War in the 17th century may have killed maybe a third of the population of Germany. It was in developing this internal culture of violence, of savagery, and the technology for it. These were major factors in Europe's conquest of the world. Well, in 1945, it came to an end. Europeans understood that the next time they played the game of mutual slaughter, it would be the end. The means of destruction had reached a point where this phase of history was over. And they have begun to make moves towards integration in the European Union, NATO, which is distinct, and other means. It's not. You can see in the current financial crisis what the achievements in integration and what the limits are. The European Union has not been able. There's a division within the European Union as to whether they should have a union-wide policy with regard to the financial crisis, or whether it should be dealt with in terms of the individual national economic entities. And so far, it's the latter that's prevailed. So there is no unified approach to it. Some steps, but not far. This illustrates, incidentally, one of the great advantages of the United States. The United States is quite different from Europe. In the United States, the indigenous population was eliminated, mostly exterminated. And it was probably the richest country in the world back in the 18th century. By the end of the 19th century, its economy surpassed that of other industrial societies combined. And as I said, by the end of the Second World War, it was overwhelmingly dominant. And I didn't mention military terms. In military terms, the United States is unique. Its military expenditures are comparable to the rest of the world combined, has a network of military bases all over the world from which it can project force, in other words, carry out intervention and aggression. It's pioneering the use of space as a tool of military action against the opposition of almost the entire world. So that's on the side. But Europe, one advantage that the United States has as a result of its history is it is a homogeneous entity. So yes, there's a national policy, right or wrong, but at least it's a general policy as to how to deal with the financial crisis. Europe is split on this, and there are other U.S. advantages. There are other respects in which the future of Europe is not clear. Europe, the United States, since the Second World War, has had an ambivalent attitude towards European unification. On the other hand, it's favored it because it's extremely good for U.S. business interests. If, say, IBM wants to invest in Europe, it's much easier if there's a European common market than if they have to target investment individually for each country with its own rules and so on. So there's been tremendous pressure. That was a large reason part of the reason for the Marshall Plan, to move towards a unification of Europe as a market and as an economic unit. On the other hand, the United States has always been opposed to European unification as a political unit. Now, you go back to the early days of the Cold War, there was considerable concern about what was called a third force. That is, Europe might strike out in an independent direction, something like, say, de Gaulle's Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals, a force which would be comparable to the United States, in fact, even greater in economic terms, and might become an independent actor in the world. Well, that hasn't happened. In fact, one of the purposes of NATO is to try to prevent it from happening. It's one of the reasons why the United States is so much in favor of adherence of the former Soviet satellites into the European Union and also NATO, is that is expected to dilute the influence of the central components of Europe, Germany and France particularly, and hence make Europe more amenable to U.S. influence. And these tensions will surely increase. Anyone in Estonia or Eastern Europe is naturally concerned about Russian power for obvious historical reasons. But nevertheless, I think that a move, though popular and understandable, was a mistake, and it goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Mikhail Gorbachev had a proposal. Gorbachev, first of all, made a remarkable concession, astonishing concession. He agreed to let a unified Germany join a hostile military alliance. Now, Estonia has its history, but Russia has its history too. Russia was practically destroyed at a huge cost by Germany alone several times during the past century, and to permit a reunified Germany to enter into a hostile military alliance run by the global superpower with a military force comparable to the rest of the world. It's an incredible concession. But there was a quid pro quo. The United States, it was in the Bush #1 administration, the Bush administration agreed that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used. That would, in their view, and Gorbachev's view, he was the prime mover, leave open a way towards a cooperative interactions between the new Russia and the West, which would not be an outcome of we rule and you obey, but rather of cooperation. In addition, it would also give Russia some strategic depth for in its natural concerns about security, given the history and obvious realities. Gorbachev also proposed a nuclear-free weapons zone from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. That would again have reduced tensions, increased security, paved the way to further cooperative relations. I think that would have been a very wise move. Notice that does not have anything to do with, say, the Baltic states joining the European Union. Yeah, they could have joined the European Union. The question is joining a hostile military alliance. That's quite different. For example, Austria and Finland and Sweden are part of the European Union, but not part of NATO, not part of a military alliance led by the United States. In my view, that was the right direction to take. Unfortunately, when Clinton came into office, one of his first acts was to back off on that agreement. One of his first acts was to expand NATO to the east. Thereby, and of course the U.S. flatly rejected the idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone. Well, okay, that naturally increased tensions and potential conflict. There were also the imposition of extremely harsh market discipline in Russia, which was favored by the bureaucracy. They enriched themselves, becoming comparable to third world elites, but it had a miserable effect on the society. Practically destroyed, largely destroyed the economy, killed millions of people, and all this was happening at the same time. And the U.S. under Clinton just rejected Gorbachev's proposals for more cooperative interaction and moved toward confrontation. Well, that became far more extreme under the Bush administration, second Bush administration, with the aggressive militarism, huge increase in the military budget, the dismantling of arms control agreements, and much else. And that led, predictably, to an increase in Russian offensive military capacity. It's going on right as we speak. I think yesterday, the Russian president announced that Russia may install missile bases in Kaliningrad. Well, that's a very ugly development. And it's a direct reaction, no one has any doubt about that, to the U.S. insistence on installing what's called an anti-missile system in Poland and the Czech Republic, components of it. Now, strategic analysts all over the world, including the United States, you can read it in the leading arms journals, top military analysts point out that those anti-missile systems are a direct threat to the Russian deterrent. And naturally, Russia will respond. And that increases the level of tension and danger. So going back to the Baltic states and NATO, though they're joining NATO is understandable, just it would be perfectly understandable for Latin American countries to join the Warsaw Pact if it still existed for the same reasons, to protect themselves from their traditional invader. It's a bad move, in my view. Actually, here I agree with the large majority of the American population that the United Nations should be supported. And in fact, I agree with the large majority of Americans that the United Nations should take the lead in international crises, and that other countries, say the United States, should follow the lead of the UN majority. In fact, it may surprise you to know that a majority of Americans, considerable majority, favor abandoning the veto in the United Nations, so that the UN will indeed be a force for dealing with international crises and problems. Now that's happened to a limited extent. The United Nations has been effective in some areas, but it's limited by the United Nations can go only as far as the major powers permit it to go, and that means overwhelmingly the United States. You can see the limits of the United Nations simply in looking at votes. So, for example, just in the last week or two, there have been two major votes in the General Assembly. One vote was on the U.S. embargo on Cuba. The vote was 183 to 3. The three were the United States, Israel votes reflexively with the United States, and Palau, a small Pacific dependency. That's the way it's been for years. The world is overwhelmingly opposed to the embargo, which it's declared to be illegal, plausibly. Latin America is completely opposed. A large majority of Americans are opposed to it, but nevertheless, Washington insists on it, insists on punishing Cuba savagely for its, for what was called in the early 60s in the internal record, its successful defiance of U.S. policies going back 150 years. A couple of days later, there was another vote in the General Assembly. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was an overwhelming vote in favor of restriction on arms sales, cross-border arms sales. There were two countries opposed, the United States and Zimbabwe. Everyone else supported it. A few abstained. Well, okay, that's finished. There can't be a cutback of the lethal sales of arms that are leading to huge massacres in the Congo and elsewhere because the major superpowers opposed. In the Security Council, we can easily. This is not uncommon in the General Assembly on a wide range of issues. In the Security Council, it's dramatic. Up until in the early years of the United Nations, most of the vetoes were from Russia. And the reason is very straightforward. Everyone acknowledged it. Because the U.S. was in such a world-dominant position that the UN did whatever it said. And the U.S. was using it as a weapon against Russia. Well, through the 1950s, with decolonization and reconstruction of other industrial societies, that control declined. The first U.S. veto at the Security Council was, I think, in 1965. By then, the UN was not under control. Now, since 1965, you can easily check the record, the U.S. is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions on a wide range of issues. Britain is second, and none of the other three veto-wielding powers are even close. And that goes even as far as Security Council resolutions calling on states to observe international law, which the U.S. vetoed. France and Britain politely abstained. And yes, that of course, that's a symbol of controls that do paralyze the United Nations in many areas. On the other hand, where the great powers, and crucially the United States, agree, they can and sometimes have done important things. The answer to this network of problems, in my opinion, is for the United States to become a functioning democracy. By that I mean a country in which, not only in which people vote the way they did yesterday, but in which policy reflects the will of the population. Now, the population in the United States is quite explicit on this. About 95% believe that the government ought to pay attention to popular opinion and object to the fact that it doesn't. About 80% believe that the country is, I'm quoting now, run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, not for the benefit of the population. And in fact, there's a very substantial divide in the United States between public opinion and public policy. It's true on international, it's true on the United Nations, as I mentioned, it's true on international affairs, it's true on domestic affairs. You look at exit polls yesterday, you find, at least according to the early ones, that for most people who voted, a very large majority, in fact, the primary issue that concerned them was health care. Now, that's been true for a long time, and it's not surprising. The U.S. has the only privatized health care system among major countries, and it's also the most inefficient and with the worst outcomes. U.S. per capita expenses on health care about twice as much as comparable countries, and the health outcomes are among the worst in the industrial world. And people really suffer from that. That's not, that's not just statistics. That's individual life. Health care is basically rationed by wealth, and that's extremely cruel. And people suffer from it and don't like it. And for decades, people have favored a national health care system. But it's simply been off the agenda. It's been described as politically impossible. It's interesting and tells you a lot about American democracy that in 2008, it's a little different. In 2008, the Democratic candidates, first John Edwards and then later Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, all proposed complicated health care plans which begin to approach what the large majority of the population wants, national health care. They don't reach it, but they at least approach it. In 2004, nobody even mentioned it. So what happened between 2004 and 2008? No change in public opinion. That remains the same. But there is a change in concentrated power. Manufacturing industry, which is, of course, a big component of U.S. power, is being seriously harmed by the highly inefficient privatized healthcare system and wants it changed so that they can compete better with, say, Canada. Okay, when a large sector of the people, the owners of the society, in effect, change their position, then it becomes politically possible. But this is only one example. It's important because it's so significant to people of a substantial divide between public opinion and public policy.
ভাবনার ঢেউ আমার কথা লইয়া যায় আমি ঘর পালাইয়া আইলাম চইলা ছাইরা আইলাম মাঝিরে মাঝি ও মাঝি ছাইরা আইলাম।
If you look at elite opinion in the United States, say Council on Foreign Relations, what they say is there's a consensus in the United States that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. Well, they're right about the articulate classes, but it's an odd consensus because it excludes the U.S. intelligence community, which just a year ago determined with what they called high confidence that Iran had abandoned its nuclear weapons program 5 years ago, if they even had one. But this is an ideological need. Doesn't matter what the facts are. It's an ideological need. Iran is independent. It's not subordinated to the U.S. will. Therefore, it's an enemy. It's kind of like Cuba. You know, large majority of the population wants to end the embargo against Cuba, but it doesn't matter. In the case of Iran, a large majority of the population is opposed to threats against Iran. Threats, let alone war. But the political class is totally in favor of them. Both candidates, all writers, everyone says all options have to be on the table. But that's not what the population wants. The population very strongly supports diplomacy, no threats. And furthermore, the population accepts what should be the solution to the problem, I think, namely a nuclear weapons-free zone in the entire region. That includes Israel, Iran, any American forces deployed there. A large majority of Americans support that. Most of the world supports it, non-aligned movement, others. But it cannot enter into political discussion. Do a Google search of the press. Nobody even mentions this possibility. Washington doesn't want it. And therefore the intellectual classes can't discuss it. But that would be the direction to go to mitigate, maybe overcome this crisis, along with improving the commercial, cultural, and other relations. That's exactly what Iranian dissidents want. In fact, are pleading for. Shirin Ebadi, Akbar Ganji, and others, what the labor movement Iran wants, and so on. But Western intellectual elites, especially in the U.S., want confrontation.
আমি ঘর ফালাইয়া আইলাম চইলা আমি ঘর ফালাইয়া আইলাম চইলা ছাইরা আইলাম
Well, there are two problems that simply stand out because they reach as far as extinction of the species. One of them is nuclear war. It's always imminent. It's a miracle that we haven't had a nuclear war since 1945. It's become very close many times, and just by miraculously didn't happen. And those dangers are getting worse. The examples that I mentioned, the missile bases and so on, they're exacerbating the problem. And we know how to solve it. There is a way to solve it, unlike other problems, namely live up to the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which require the nuclear states to take good faith measures to negotiate an end to nuclear weapons. And that's supported by quite powerful voices. I mean, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State George Shultz, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, many others have pointed out that unless we eliminate nuclear weapons, as we're legally required to do, there may not be a future to talk about. That's one. The other is ecological disaster. I mean, what's called conservative opinion, I don't think the term should be used, is opposed to doing anything serious to deal with a coming enormous crisis, very serious crisis. The world may be hitting a tipping point on this where you can't do much. There's an overwhelming scientific consensus, but the editors of the Wall Street Journal and similar segments don't think we should do anything about it. In their view, short-term profit for their friends is much more important than whether their grandchildren have a world to live in. Okay, they have various other excuses, but that's basically what it comes down to. That's a huge problem, and we have to do something about it now. The longer it's not imminent like nuclear war. That's ends everything, but we're at a point where the longer we delay, the worse it's going to be for our grandchildren and for poor people over the world who are the ones who are going to suffer most. There are very few free market societies. The United States, for example, is very far from a free market society. In fact, the fact that we're doing what we are now doing is a result of the growth and development and innovation that takes place in the state sector of the society. It's within the dynamic state sector of the society that we find in the United States and other countries too, in which we find most of the innovation and development, say computers, the internet, lasers, microelectronics, biotechnology, aircraft, just run across the list. The advanced economy crucially relies on the dynamism of the state sector. Computers and the internet, for example, were within the state sector in the United States for about 30 years, pretty much, before they were handed over to private enterprise. Sometimes private industry becomes involved, but usually on government contracts. In fact, we see that right now, right at this minute. And not only does high technology and the economy of the future rest primarily on the dynamic state sector, but so does short-term economic growth. In the last quarter, U.S. economic growth was very low, but the only reason it wasn't lower is because there was the Bush administration carried out sort of quietly a large increase in Pentagon spending. Well, that's a stimulus to the economy. Keynesian stimulus to the economy. Presumably they did it in order to try to look better in time for the election. But it was significant, maybe a couple of percentage points in GDP growth, which would have been negative otherwise. So first of all, there are very limited free markets. They exist to an extent, and you're right, to the extent that a free market exists, these are going to be serious problems. Because in a free market, you're supposed to maximize personal gain. Corporation, for example, is legally obligated to look after its own interests, whatever the effect on the public. So yes, that carries with it an undermining of social goals. You can see this in all sorts of domains. However, it doesn't seem to me one that can't be overcome. There can be regulation, intervention. Corporations can be democratized. They can be taken over by their workforce and communities. There's no rule that you have to have totalitarian institutions. And corporations are about as totalitarian as any human institution that's been devised. So yes, it's a problem, but it can be overcome by popular efforts.
Ma võin põrgu sõida, ma võin päevale armu anda, ma võin humanist olla, ma võin kangelane olla, ma võin ennast üles puua, ma võin hulluks minna, ma võin tõtt rääkida, ma võin Pariisi sõita, ma võin rõhutute kaitseks välja astuda, ma võin nooreks jääda, ma võin teid hammustada, ma võin ülekohut nähes nutta, ma võin filosofeerida, ma võin geniaalseks näitlejaks saada, ma võin kirjutada raamatuid, mis käsitlevad inimhinge saladusi, ma võin maailma paremaks muuta, ma võin väga palju, ma võin kohutavalt palju, ma võin sõjad ära hoida, ma võin näljastele oma leiva loovutada, ma võin naiste ja laste eest surma minna, ma võin valetamise jätta, ma võin varastamise jätta, ma võin teiseks inimeseks saada, ma võin õhus lennata, ma võin vees ujuda, ma võin nähtamatuks muutuda, ma võin kuu peal käia, ma võin surematu olla, ma võin kõike teha, ma võin kõike olla, mul pole piire, ma olen vaba, ma olen looduse kroon, ma olen homo sapiens, ma olen jumal, ma olen kosmos, ma olen inimene, ma olen, ma võin, ma võin, ma võin, ma võin, ma võin, ma võin.
I mean, it's a shocking indictment of the economics profession that they weren't shrieking about the coming crisis because it was obvious. It's immediate. It has a long-term causes, but also an immediate cause. The immediate cause is what are called subprime mortgages. Housing in the United States, but other countries too, England, Spain, elsewhere, housing prices were going way out of line with their value. There is a trend line over time. Housing prices relate to the growth of the economy. But it started in the late Clinton years, but just went out of control in the Bush years. That has a huge effect on the economy. I mean, the United States is deeply in debt. Actually, debt is greater than personal wealth by now. And a large part of the debt is based on inflated housing costs. So you want to buy a house, you get a mortgage at a small input, and you hope that then you go into debt. You use the debt to purchase commodities way beyond your means, and that leads to inflated consumption way beyond the productive level of the society. A huge amount of imports, an enormous current account deficit, which is impossible to sustain, and it was obviously going to burst. But everyone sailed along happily, thinking, look, we're making money tomorrow, so why should we pay attention? Well, okay, it burst. Now it's a systemic disaster. Actually, there are much more long-term causes, and they shouldn't be overlooked. The basic cause, probably not time to go into this now, is the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. After the Second World War, the United States and Britain, the victors, John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, instituted a global international economic system. It was based on several fundamental principles. One was currencies were restricted within a narrow band, and the role of the IMF was to keep them that way. So you didn't have a lot of speculation against currencies, in fact, very little, which is mostly waste. And governments had the right to control capital, so they could prevent capital flight. Now that is extremely significant. You cannot have serious development if governments can't control capital flight. And you certainly can't have welfare state measures. That was perfectly well understood. The reason is that investors become what's called a virtual parliament who vote on measures that a government carries out. And if they don't like them, they destroy the economy with capital flight. That's happened in Europe. It's happened all over the third world. So a basis for democracy is ability to control capital, also the basis for growth. Now, in the early 1970s, that system was dismantled and finance was liberalized. Okay, that's a crisis in the waiting. And in fact, since that time, there have been repeated financial crises, much more than before, and they keep getting deeper. Combined with that was a kind of a religious mania about market fundamentalism. Now, as I just mentioned before, it's largely myth because the rich countries make sure that the wealthy are not subject to market discipline. They do that in all kinds of ways, like the state sector of the economy. But there was a kind of an ideological mania about self-correcting markets, so you can leave them alone, you don't need regulation, and so on. The theoretical basis was extremely weak. The factual basis was non-existent. But it did lead to a significant dismantling of regulation through the Reagan years, increasingly in the Clinton years, and dramatically in the Bush years. And the same was happening all over the world. Well, okay, when you have a crisis in the making from liberalized capital, which underprices risk for well-known reasons, and you have no regulatory apparatus, you're just asking for a crisis. How to deal with it? Well, first of all, I think we should go back to something like the Bretton Woods system. There should be controls on capital. Those who control capital should not be free, independently of the will of the population, to export it and use it as they like, even for anti-social purposes. The problems have to be dealt with about currency regulation. But in general, there has to be, just at the very minimum, there has to be a much stricter regulatory apparatus, and a firm regulatory apparatus has to be instituted in a state capitalist economy just in order to keep it viable. And I think will be, because it's in the interests of business itself. So some kind of regulatory apparatus will be reinstituted. Now, in a more democratic society, a bank bailout, like Paulson's $700 billion bailout, would be combined with public control over what the banks do. In a less democratic society, like that of the United States, there's no public control. So what's turning out is pretty much what economist Joseph Stiglitz predicted, Nobel laureate. He pointed out about the Paulson bailout that we can pour money in, but they'll pour money out into their own pockets unless we have a veto power, that is public control. Well, the ideology of the doctrine of the business-run society is you can't have that, and it's just laying the basis for new crises. These are really questions of will and choice. These matters are not determined. So take just the United States. The 1920s were very much like the last 8 years, the Bush years. Tremendous inequality, a lot of euphoria about endless wealth for the very wealthy. The labor movement had been completely smashed quite violently, to an extent that shocked even right-wing visitors from England and Australia. And it looked like it was going to be a utopia of the masters, the end of history. Okay, then came the 1930s, and it was all radically reversed. Great uprising of the labor movement, CIO formation, civil rights, pressure for social reform, and the government had to respond to it. Again, in the 1950s, it was a period of another period that was called end of history. Utopia of the masters, very quiet, apathetic, wealthy. The post-war economy was very successful, largely state-based economy. And then came the 1960s. The country exploded. And the effects are striking. I mean, in fact, we saw them in yesterday's election, of one of the effects, but it's much more widespread than that. Well, what's going to happen next? Again, it depends on just what it's always depended on. If there is an engaged, active, dedicated public, organized public, it can bring about a significant positive change. If there isn't, then the bitter class war that is always fought unremittingly by the highly class-conscious business classes, that will continue. And we'll go back to something like extreme inequality, stagnation. I mean, the last 30 years in the United States have been one of the worst periods of economic history for the large majority of the population. Wages, real incomes have stagnated, real wages have stagnated pretty much for the majority. Benefits have declined, working hours have gone up. There has been wealth produced, but in very few pockets, and yes, we'll go back to that. And I'm speaking about the United States, but these observations generalize around the world. It simply depends on what people will do. I think there's reason for hope, but not illusion. It's hard work, just as it's always been. We have a lot of freedom, a lot of privilege, more than ever in history in places like the United States, but in many ways the freest country in the world. But it was not gifts from above. It was won by struggle from below, and that's the way it's been everywhere. So the answer to the question is, it's in our hands.
ühe Põhjala väikeriigi juubeli puhul on ühte tema teatrisse kogunenud kirev kunstnike seltskond mitmetest maailma nurkadest. Koos musitseerides ning kunsti luues loodetakse leida vastus pakilisele küsimusele, kas on elu pärast kapitalismi. Igal nädalal innustavad neid erinevad globaalse haardega mõtlejad, lähevad ringlusesse üha uued värsked ideed, saavad vastatud üha uued küsimused. Kunstnikud mõistavad, tunnetavad ja reageerivad. Nad kutsuvad seda vonKrahl.Akadeemiaks.
So that's a matter of considerable significance. We should be willing to put it into context. This is 150 years after the formal declaration of equality. And notice that while it's a political victory, it's not really overcoming racism. To see how much that's true, simply take a look at, for example, incarceration rates. The U.S. has far and away the highest per capita incarceration in any part of the world where statistics mean anything. That's since about 1980. It's been increasing rapidly since 1980. It has nothing to do with crime. Crime's been declining, and it's overwhelmingly black and, to an extent, Latino. That's a reflection of much larger general problems in the society. Nevertheless, it is a historic change that a ugly tradition of racism that goes back to the founding. This year in the Democratic primary, there were two candidates, a woman and a black. The African American won the election. 40 years ago, any of that would have been totally inconceivable. So there's been a big change since the 1960s, and that's very significant. Whatever one thinks about the candidates, that's a tribute to the activism, mostly of young people, in the 1960s, and its aftermath, the feminist movement, which radically changed the consciousness of the country, was in the 70s, other developments in later years. But these activist movements have, in fact, contributed to civilizing the country quite significantly. It's striking that if you look at exit polls, the largest support for Obama was among younger people who have been through this experience of activism and its effects. At the end of the Second World War, the United States literally had half the world's wealth. The war was very beneficial to the U.S. economy. It ended the Depression, industrial production almost quadrupled in a semi-command economy. And it not only had half the wealth of the world, but incomparable security. It controlled the entire Western Hemisphere, both oceans, opposite sides of both oceans, controlled Middle East energy resources, and it was bound to decline. And as decolonization set in and the other industrial countries recovered from the disaster of the war, it did decline. By about 1970, the U.S. share of world wealth was maybe 25%, and it stayed pretty much like that since. By the early 1970s, it was already clear that the world economy was becoming what's called tripolar. There was a North American economic area, European economic area centered on Germany, mounting of the country, has been significantly mitigated to the extent that a black candidate can be elected president. Looking over a longer stretch, the hegemony of the United States in the world system has been declining since the Second World War.